Privet Katila Bondingriski desu, and this is the weekly Russo-Ukrainian War update for the week of September 23rd to September 29th. I am a day late in posting this, maybe 2 days depending on how fast I upload this video. I've been very busy. It's actually lucky I managed to get this video recorded at all, but I managed to find some time. So my job necessitates that I continue, that I have a lot of time. There's a lot of things I have to do, and so there might be a slowdown in videos. But I'll try to get this weekly update when I can. Right now it's just a bit hectic. But this week I hope to go over what happened. So we're going to start with the main in Avdiivka, or the part of the Donetsk front. So the purpose of this, the initiative on this front has gone to the Russians, as we've seen. The purpose right now for the Russians is to push the Ukrainians out of the suburbs of Donetsk and stop the daily terror bombings of Donetsk. They've actually and right now the main focus of that has been in Avdiivka, but there's been also battles in the south of Donetsk as well. We're going to talk about Avdiivka. So this week there's been some changes, but not as much as the previous, but there's been still intense clashes. The Russians have secured themselves along the rail line and on the terracon, or the slag heap, which is the dominant height in the area. In fact, we saw a Russian flag and the flag of the Russian unit that managed to take it hoisted here, and the Ukrainians try to bomb that flag. So this proves that the Russians have control over the slag heap here, and they have secured themselves along these rail lines. This has been confirmed by also Ukrainian sources. So the front line kind of is generally along this rail line. The Russians on the north have basically consolidated and have been repelling Ukrainian attacks this week mostly as well. And the northern part of the Avdiivka front in this area also runs along the rail line, more or less. Right now there's been some rumors of the fighting been reaching this tree line right here, and on this kind of forest line in front of the slag heap as well. So the two main bases for Avdiivka, for the Ukrainians, is this Avdiivka coke plant, the industrial hub here, and on this area of high-rise buildings. And then also the hotel here, which kind of covers the pre-war fortifications and this forest line. So there's a defense belt here, a defense belt here, and a defense belt here. Everything else is still defended. There's trenches and everything, but not. These are like kind of fortification strongholds. So to the north, the Russians managed to secure their positions and are preparing to probably continue offensive operations to take these two settlements of Stepova and Berdichi. But we shall see if they're able to do that. But so far, they've managed to continue to hold on to these positions. In the south is where there's been actually more progress for the Russians, mostly on this south part now. They've advanced more towards Servina, which is another village that they need to take. They've taken more places on these tree lines here, and they've also advanced more to the west in Vadana, closer to the Peremyska. There's two purposes of this: is to not only outflank Peremyska, which if they manage to do that, they'll be able to attack on the flank of it, right in the back, and force the Ukrainians to kind of, it might compromise Ukrainian defenses here. And the Ukrainians, as we mentioned, have been trying to use this city to attack, or have been wanting to attack here to cut off the attacks to the south of Avdiivka. So this is part of the Avdiivka offensive. It's also part of the Donetsk offensive. They took Pesky about a year ago, but they also need to take this to kind of push the Ukrainians fully back, probably all the way back to this area here. But so this is part of kind of the Avdiivka front, because both sides are using this to try to get behind their defense lines, or to compromise the attacks. So and the Russians have advanced more on the north of Peremyska here, while the Ukrainians have been trying to push the Russians here, and there's been just small little movements on this area, but this is part of the attack as well. There's also been, according to Rybar, as we can see on this map, this is Rybar's map for the Battle of Avdiivka. You can see the Ukrainians trying to attack and do these counterattacks. You can also see some movement on the pre-2014 border, but mostly we see it in this area here near Opena, one of the biggest changes is that the Russians managed to capture the quarry in this area. So this area is under the Russians. I would say the Ukrainian forward line is now along this tree line, right in front of their main fortified stronghold here. This gives them a high-rise advantage over this area. However, the Ukrainians also have forward units here, so they don't enter it. But the Russians don't need to enter it. They just need to secure their fortifications here so that they could continue moving towards Severna and Tonica, which, this is very heavily fortified. On this map, on most maps actually, we don't really see the extent of fortifications. We just see, oh, it's a tree line. Because this map isn't like, there's like some pre-2014, you could see like 2014 like defense belts, right? You could see it here, for example. You could see the trenches here, because these were built before the war. But this map, a lot of maps don't, they update every few years, and this war's only been on for about a year and a half, so we don't actually see the trench updates. So we don't actually see the extent of fortifications here. But there is a lot. That's why it takes so long to burst through them, and why every single meter that the Russians take, like for example, this map says they captured this point of there's probably some major Ukrainian fortification here that the Russians took, and this takes a lot of effort. So that's why it's so slow. It's going to be a slow grinding process. It won't take months like Bakhmut, I don't think, but it will probably take till the end of the year, so maybe another 2 months or something, depending on how strongly the Ukrainians defend. So the Battle of Avdiivka continues to be the main center of attention now. The Russians have consolidated in the north and repelled Ukrainian attacks, and they are advancing more in the south. So that is the Avdiivka, along with other areas of the Donetsk front. There's been actually some movement in the Marinka front, mostly in this area. They've been trying to advance to this area here. There's been battles here. There's been some geolocated footages of the Russians attacking the Ukrainians on this line and shelling them, and actually advancing with armored vehicles here. And there's also been lots of bombings up on this area on the northeastern part of Marinka. So usually the battles used to be on this area, but they've kind of moved to the north here. And I think what the Russians probably want to do is advance here and make this be the new defense belt with these rivers, and probably try to take Grigorivka, I think it's called. Attack from the side here and then attack from the north, and with the two-side attack, capture this and basically have this be the new front line. Because once they take these two villages, that'll be enough to get the Ukrainian artillery away from Donetsk, and then they also get to the back of Krasnogorivka. They don't need to assault this town head-on, but in order to actually capture it, they also need to capture Peremyska, which is also part of the movement here. So as you can see, this entire battlefield from Avdiivka to Marinka is part of the same campaign, but with different battles, with the purpose of basically, because if Peremyska falls, and and the Russians advance here, and Marinka falls, which basically almost has anyway, then Krasnogorivka would automatically fall, almost basically automatically fall, because then the Russians would attack on the sides and force the Ukrainian defenders out. So there's a lot of moving parts here. So there's been movements in the southern part of Marinka, trying to secure along these rivers. Again, the whole purpose is to push the Ukrainians away from Donetsk. We're going to also go to the next area of attack, which is where the Ukrainians are having success. So in the Donetsk front, the Russians are pushing and having success. The Ukrainians, so as I mentioned last week, they've also advanced in Kherson. They managed to advance in the they've occupied parts of the village of Krinky. They haven't fully taken it. I mentioned this last video, and as of this week, so by the end of this week, the Ukrainians are still in this village. The Russians have counterattacked. They have taken back a lot of Krinky, but the Ukrainians still have control. They especially have control over these islands, and they are making good use of them. And so the Ukrainians haven't advanced much here. They've mostly been switched to defense mode after their surprise attack last week. But this is basically because the Ukrainians have been able to actually cross the Dnieper and actually occupy an island, occupy a village. They still hold the islands here and threaten Pitstepia and Pashintokivka. They still hold Dacia, so they have like a foothold here. And so because the Ukrainians are taking the islands and actually landed on the right bank, the Russians actually fired the leader of what they call the Dnieper Group. So the Dnieper Group is the group of Russian units that are in charge of defending the Kherson frontier. And they replaced him. They replaced that general who basically failed to defend Kherson with Teplinsky. Teplinsky was actually the guy who actually controlled the Kherson front earlier when the Russians were on this bank of the river, and he defended it very well. A lot of people don't, a lot of people have a mistake about the Kherson offensive, that the Ukrainians somehow beat the Russians back. On a technical sense, yes, but they didn't actually push them back through force of arms. The Russians made a choice that, hey, the supply situation is critical, so we're just going to fall back. The Ukrainians didn't just push them all the way back. The defenses were too strong. And so now that there's no supply choke point, now this is where, you could actually defend. And Teplinsky was very good with defending Kherson last time, and he'll probably be good defending, because the Russians are not going to advance in this area at all, because then it counteract why they left in the first place. So defense is the name of the game here. The Ukrainians are still advancing. They're now focused on defense after they took a village and more islands, and the Russians are counterattacking. But we shall see if the Ukrainians can continue to develop on their success in Kherson. In the Zaporozhye front, there's actually been a very interesting change there. I don't know if there's been a new Ukrainian commander or not, but the Ukrainians have basically managed to go on the offensive again in this area. They sent actually full-on armored units, and if you count the number of armored units they've lost a few dozen. The Russian Ministry of Defense says there's like 50, but it's very intense about how do you say this? About how it's kind of interesting how they made a new armored assault here to try to improve their tactical position here. Again, I don't think they're trying to break through here. I think they're just trying to improve upon their positions here, improve their salient here, try to take Kopany, try to take Verbovo. But so far to no effect. This map says they took a tree line to the west of Robotina, but they lost like 3 Leopard tanks. They lost a lot of Bradleys. They lost a lot of equipment here for that armored assault, which is kind of interesting that they switched to that. I think there was a new Ukrainian commander who thought, maybe they thought that the Russians got preoccupied with Kherson, and maybe that was the whole purpose of the Kherson offensive. Maybe the whole purpose of it was, they wanted to divert Russian troops here, and then they thought if they diluted enough troops from Zaporozhye, they could actually make the breakthrough. But turns out the Russians still have enough troops there to deflect attacks. So the Ukrainians are on the attack here, but they haven't secured any major breakthroughs except maybe a tree line near Robotina for like a dozen or like a multiple dozen equipment losses. In the South Donetsk area, the Russians are still improving their positions north of Pryutnia. They're trying to basically establish themselves along these ravines, basically make the positions in Pryutnia a lot more defensible. Again, the Ukrainians, if they want to advance in this area, need to take the flanks, and they have failed to do that thus far. So the more Russians improve on their flanks, the harder it will be for the Ukrainians to advance. And who knows, maybe the Russians will one day try to storm and take these 2 villages back, but they don't really need to. This front's probably going to be static for a long time, unless they want to, because it doesn't really help any side to advance in this area. We're going to now go to the Bakhmut section of the front, and basically the main fights have been on both. And this is actually this is one of the only fronts actually that are focused on both. How do you say it? Both sides are on offensive operations, and both sides are on the defensive. So let me explain. On the south, the Ukrainians are on the offensive, and the Russians are on the defense. The battles are over this rail line. The Ukrainians have on certain areas of the rail line. The Ukrainians are entrenched. On some areas, the Russians are entrenched. And so the battle, basically, the Ukrainians are trying to break through this defense line, which is where the Russians have established themselves after Klishivka and Andriivka fell. However, the Russians still hold firm. However, it's still possible for the Ukrainians to puncture a hole here that will force the Russians to go back to avoid getting surrounded. The main purpose of this is to cut off the Bakhmut-Gorlivka highway, which is the main supply route for the south. Not the main supply route, they could still supply it. It's not like Russians are going to be cut off, but this is basically, this highway represents kind of like the main artery for the southern defense of Bakhmut. If this rail line falls, then it's going to, the Ukrainians are going to try to break through here and capture this highway and cut it off from Gorlivka and basically threaten the southern part of Bakhmut. And the Russians will have to be forced to get a step back here. And I guess the hope is that the more they push, if they get to the south too much, if the Ukrainians start pushing here, then the northern part would be kind of in threat as well. So this front, has to hold in order to not compromise the defense of the northern part of Bakhmut. Now, so right now I think the limited goal of the Ukrainians is to keep pushing to take the Bakhmut-Gorlivka highway to complicate the logistics of the southern defense of Bakhmut. But their main goal is that they want to capture Bakhmut back because they want to deny the Russians the ability to say, hey, we got any victory, because it's more of a morale thing, because this has been, besides Bakhmut, the Russians haven't actually really gained much since the end of since the early summer, midsummer of 2022. Bakhmut was their winter offensive, what they gained from the winter offensive in the spring offensive in 2023. And so, the Ukrainians want to reverse that for morale purposes. They want to say, hey, you actually got this for nothing. We retook it. But in order to take that, they want to do a surround Bakhmut, put the squeeze on it, and then force the Russians back. But again, all their attacks on the northern part have been failures. On the south, there's been it took them 4 months to take these two villages. It's been a month, I think almost a month now since they've been battling over this rail line, and the Russians still hold the rail line. So we'll have to see how much more troops Ukraine's willing to spend to try to break this defense line to continue pushing in the south, or if they'll even be successful at that. But again, fighting is still continuing on the south. On the northern part, it's the opposite. The Russians are on the advance, and the Ukrainians are on the defense. There's been some rumors that the Russians have entered the village of Veskulivka here in the north, near Sakovonsety, to the west of it. But I think it's mostly probably just, they probably entered somewhere here, kind of like how they said they took Oreko-Vasilyevka, but probably just entered the first few houses here. So the Russians are pushing here to improve their positions here, while the Ukrainians are pushing here. So it's kind of like the one front where both sides are on the attack and on the defense. In terms of the Serysk front and the Luhansk front in general, there's been no changes of actually, if anything, to kind of talk about. There's been fighting, there's been shelling, there's been clashes. Just because I don't report on like someone taking a piece of land or like what the advancements here are, does not mean there's not like active shelling and such, and like active clashes. But there's been no really advancements of note, I should say, on this front. So yeah, that's basically what's been happening on this front. So yeah, that's what happened for this week. In terms of other things, North Korean ammo has been starting to appear on Russian frontline units, and Ukraine is still, they're kind of on the. They've been getting kind of like a bad hand this week. I mean, this year. Supplies are going to be. Ukraine's not going to be cut off from Western supplies. It's not like one moment the West is going to flip a switch and stop funding Ukraine, but they're going to start getting more like kind of shitty stuff. They're not going to get the top-notch, big buster stuff they got in the winter of last year, because the winter of last year they're coming off the victories in Kharkov and Kherson, and Zelensky and the Ukrainian government actually thought they could defeat the Russians. They're like, hey, give us a big package, and we could repeat the successes of Kharkov and Kherson in Zaporozhye and take the land bridge. And I mean, that was a fair point. Like, could the Russians actually fail again? But people kind of mistook the lessons that had to be learned from these offensives. That you can't repeat them here because the Russians mitigated it. So, yeah, they failed, and now it's like, oh well, this is a bad investment. They're not going to completely cut Ukraine off, but Ukraine's kind of in a bad situation. Russia is industrializing, getting more stuff. Ukraine is getting less stuff. And in this war of attrition, which is what this war is, it favors Russia in the long run. So that is the video. I hope you enjoyed. Please like this video and subscribe to my channel if you want to see more videos like this. And share this video around and comment any of your thoughts as well. And so aim high, wander on, from America with Russian love.